Hey there guys, it's Grace. Welcome back to my channel. If you didn't watch my last video, I recently went on a road trip in Australia down to Victoria, staying in the forests, and while I was there I went to see the giant redwood trees that we have here in Australia. In that video I was talking about Julia Butterfly Hill and how I was recently looking more into her story and feeling very inspired to paint some sort of a tribute piece to her time up in the redwood tree. While I was there, I did spend a little bit of time sketching and just being in the forest, and now I'm going to bring you along with me while I bring this idea to life in my newest painting. The first thing I did before starting work on this painting was opening up my new set of watercolours that was gifted to me by Lightwish. These are Paul Rubens watercolours. I've never tried this brand before, and it came with this lovely little colour chart that I could paint on. And I have been sent paintbrushes and papers, books and stuff before, but this was my first time being gifted with actual watercolours, so I was very grateful and excited to open all these up. I like the individual packaging, so every time I open them up I can be surprised whatever colours are there. I did quite like the range, and I was especially excited for some of the pinks and purples because I don't have a great many of those, and there was a very lovely purple in this set. And of course always exciting to paint out the swatches and see what they look like on the paper. Here's my handy little watercolour chart. I had this sitting next to me while I painted, and it was actually quite helpful to see what the colours would look like as they dried. And here's the artwork I came up with, all inked and ready to be painted. Quite simple, a girl high up in a redwood tree looking at the moon, and I sketched in some of the surrounding forests and hills down below to try and put into perspective a little bit of the scale and how high up she is in this tree. And at my easel, I wasn't really sure how I was going to put this palette, and then I realized it can come out like this. So that's very handy if you're using your watercolors at an easel like I am here. Now just putting down some masking fluid over my moon and some of the stars in the sky, and then starting off the painting. I've got this very lovely bright blue here. I knew that I wanted the background to be a really bright blue, and then of course our moon is back there, so my character in the tree would be somewhat silhouetted against the sky. At this early stage, I was really quite unsure how I was going to paint the background, whether I was going to do it darker or lighter than the sky, and I just haven't really worked with many faraway views like this. And so I decided to do what I always do when I'm not sure how to paint something but I want to get on with the painting, which is to focus on the areas first that I know how to paint. So in the beginning I just focused on the girl in the tree and a little bit on the sky. So I thought I'd talk a little about Julia Hill and why her story inspired me so much. If you don't know anything about her, in the late 90s, Julia Hill, with the help of the organization, I believe it was Earth First, ascended this giant old California redwood to stay up there as a tree sitter to protest the deforestation. So they would get these people up in the trees, and then the loggers couldn't cut the trees down while they were there. And I believe there was some unresponsible logging going on, quite harsh on the environment, causing these landslides for local communities, not to mention cutting down these hundreds of year-old trees that are quite magnificent and ancient. And so Julia Hill went up this 200-foot redwood and was living on 2 6x4-foot platforms. I believe she was only supposed to be up there for a week or so, but ended up sticking it out for over 2 years with harassment from helicopters, wild storms, cold temperatures, and people calling up telling her to come down, you're crazy. But I was watching some old interviews, and for her it was so important to stick it out, because if you weren't going to stick it out and follow through till the end, you might not as well have started it in the first place. I believe she was about 23, 24 at the time, which is the same age as I am now, and I think what inspired me so much about this whole thing was just her attitude towards the situation. I have always been quite a strong-willed person. I have my strong principles, and I share quite the same sentiment as her, which is that there's no point drawing a line if you're not going to stand behind it till the end. And she really stood behind hers. Her unshakable convictions and the actions to back it up, just so inspiring and resonated with me in a certain kind of way. And so after 738 days, she ended up coming down. They'd reached an agreement. She had to pay $50,000 that she and the organization had raised to the logging company, and then Luna and the surrounding forest were protected. I hope I got most of the facts correct, but I recommend you go on YouTube and look up. You can find interviews from when she's up in the tree and videos of her coming down, and those are really cool to see from the actual time this was all happening. Now back to my painting. At this point I was quite happy with how my distant trees were looking, but I knew I had to make a bold decision, so I laid down this very dark blue here. It just really didn't technically make sense for this ground area to be lighter than the sky at this kind of twilight time in the evening. And I knew I wanted some mist in this view, but I reasoned that I could lift up some of the paint later on and also make the top of the trees darker to give the illusion of mist in the valleys. And solidifying some of my shapes by darkening up the edges with ink now. Especially my tree, as it will start to get darker with more layers of paint. And then now I'm going in, taking off the masking fluid and softening up the edges to create a little glow around the moon and cleaning up some of the stars. And I did decide to leave the trees in the background with no ink lines. But I did go in with some dark purple paint just along the ridges to define some of the edges, and I think this works out well, having the foreground more textured with the ink lines and the background more soft. Also lifting some of the paint in the valleys really gave a misty look. I loved that. And now I'm using some gouache. I got some white and blue gouache, and I mainly used this a little bit on the moon and to add some extra stars, but it was more to go between some of the branches, the little gaps, and peeking back behind to really make the background seem like it's glowing through. And I cleaned up some of my hazy edges. I did leave some of the hazy edges. I like the look of the watercolor bleeding a little, but I just love painting in these very contrasting colors. Dark if it's a dark background, or like this light if it's a light background. I think it just solidifies my forms and really accentuates the shapes in a way I love. And that is pretty much it for the painting. I ended up calling it Luna after the tree, which I believe is called Luna because Julia went up in the tree during a full moon for the light that it provided. And I thought it would be a little nod to the story behind this painting, and it suits pretty well because Luna is the Spanish word for moon. I feel there's a bit of a theme lately with my art and trees, drawing ladies in trees and under trees, and that's purely coincidental, but I hope you've been enjoying the tree paintings. Julia Hill and the events that took place, it really inspired me for some reason. Seeing her absolute stubbornness and determination and willpower just was so incredible, and I wanted to make something inspired by this feeling in these events. And I really enjoyed these watercolours. I'll be using them regularly now, and I'll link them down below if you'd like to check out any of their watercolour sets they have. They also have some very nice watercolour brushes. I highly recommend looking into Julia's story if this topic sparked your interest, and thanks very much for watching this video. I'll talk to you in my next one. Goodbye.